The rain comes sideways off the gray water, and the man standing at the foot of the memorial cannot move. His hand is flat against the granite. Under his palm, cut deep into the stone, is a name he has carried his whole life without ever expecting to find it here. Beside him, a German shepherd presses against his leg, and will not stop pressing, as if the dog already understands what the man is only beginning to. His name was Dean Marsh, though he had not heard anyone say it in full for a long time. He was 41 years old, tall and squared at the shoulders, with a face that the years and the sun had worked over until it looked carved rather than grown. His hair was dark, cut short, going gray at the temples in a way he never bothered to hide. A thin scar ran along the left side of his jaw, a souvenir from a transport rollover in a country he no longer named out loud. He had the eyes of someone who never truly stopped scanning rooms, roads, exits, and people. He had spent 11 years in the Marine Corps, and the years since, drifting between contract jobs that kept him moving, because moving was easier than staying still long enough to be asked questions he could not answer. The dog was named Birch. He was a working German shepherd, 6 years old, broad through the chest, with a tan and black saddle coat and ears that stood up straight and alert no matter how tired the rest of him was. Birch had come to Dean 4 years earlier through a program that paired veterans with dogs nobody else wanted, and the two of them had been a single unit ever since. Birch rarely reacted to anything without reason. Dean trusted that more than he trusted most words spoken by most men. If this story stays with you, take a moment to subscribe and stay until the end, because what Dean found on that wall changed everything he believed about where he came from. Dean had not planned to be in this town at all. He had taken a short hauling job up the coast, a simple run, delivering restored fishing equipment to a harbor cooperative, and the route had carried him through a small place called Harmon Bay. It was the kind of town that had been built on the water and never quite recovered from the water pulling back. Boats sat in the marina under blue tarps. Half the storefronts on the main street were dark. The diner still ran, and the hardware store still ran, and there was a small stone war memorial in a triangle of grass near the harbor where 3 roads met. He had stopped only because Birch needed to stretch his legs. That was the truth of it. There was no plan, no pull, no sense of destiny in him. He parked the truck, clipped the leash, and let the dog lead him across the wet grass toward the memorial, because the dog wanted to go that way, and Dean had no reason to argue. The memorial was older than he expected. A low granite wall, maybe 12 feet long, set with a bronze plaque at the center, and rows of names cut into the stone on either side. Some of the names were from wars Dean had only read about. Others were more recent. He read them the way he always read such things, slowly, with the quiet respect of a man who knew that each name had been somebody's whole world. He was not looking for anything. He did not expect to find anything. Then Birch stopped. The dog planted himself in front of the right side of the wall and would not move. His ears came forward. He looked at the stone, then up at Dean, then back at the stone, and a low sound came out of him that was not a growl and not a whine, but something in between. Dean had seen Birch do this exactly twice before, both times when something was wrong in a way the dog could feel before Dean could. He crouched beside the animal and followed his line of sight to the row of names cut into the granite at chest height. The name in the stone was Raymond Marsh. Dean's father had been named Raymond Marsh. His father had left when Dean was 4 years old and had never come back, and the story Dean had grown up with, the only story his mother ever gave him, was that the man had simply disappeared the way some men do, slipping out of a life that did not fit them. There had been no funeral. There had been no grave. There had been a hole in the shape of a man, and a mother who pressed her lips together whenever the subject came up, and a boy who learned early not to ask. He read the name 3 times to be sure his eyes were not making it up. Raymond Marsh. Below it, a date, the year. Dean was 5. The pressure in his chest tightened unexpectedly. For a long moment he could not have said what he was feeling, only that it was large and old and had been waiting in him for 36 years without his knowing. Birch leaned his whole weight against Dean's side. The rain kept coming sideways off the bay. Dean stayed crouched there until his knees ached. He told himself it was a different Raymond Marsh, that the name was common enough, that there was no reason a man who had walked out of his family should end up honored on a wall in a coastal town hundreds of miles from where Dean had been raised. He told himself all of that. He did not believe any of it because Birch was still leaning, and Birch did not lean without reason. He needed to know. That was the thing that surprised him most. After a lifetime of training himself not to need to know, of treating his father as a closed door, he had stopped knocking on before he was old enough to read. He found that he needed to know who this Raymond Marsh had been, and how his name had come to be cut into this particular stone. The diner was the obvious place to start. It sat at the end of the main street, with steam on its windows and a hand-painted sign that read Wexler's. And when Dean pushed the door open with Birch at his heel, the warmth hit him like a hand on the chest. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was somewhere in her 60s, small and quick, with reading glasses, pushed up into gray hair and an apron that had seen a great many years of work. Her name, he would learn, was Fay Wexler, and she had run the diner for 31 years, and she missed very little of what happened in Harmon Bay. She looked at the dog first, the way the good ones always did, and her face softened. Then she looked at Dean. "We don't get many strangers walking dogs in the rain," she said. "Coffee?" He sat at the counter. Birch settled at his boots, watchful but calm, which told Dean more about Fay Wexler than anything she could have said. He let her pour the coffee, and he wrapped his hands around the cup, and he tried to find a way to ask the question that did not sound like a man chasing ghosts. "The memorial by the harbor," he said, "the name's on the wall. Do you know how a person gets on it?" Fay studied him. "Folks from here who served and didn't come home," she said. "Or came home and we lost them after. We're a small town. We remember our own." She paused. "Why do you ask?" Dean turned the cup a quarter turn on the saucer. "There's a name on it," he said. "Raymond Marsh." Something changed in the woman's face. It was not alarm, and it was not grief, exactly. It was recognition. The careful recognition of someone deciding how much to say to a man she had only just met. She set the pot down. "You knew Ray?" she asked. "He was my father," Dean said. The words came out flat, the way he said most things that cost him. "I think he was my father. I never really knew him. He left when I was 4. Fay Wexler was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, the grill ticked and the rain ran down the windows in long gray ropes. Then she pulled off her reading glasses and folded them slowly, and looked at Dean with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. "Honey," she said softly, "your daddy didn't leave you. Your daddy spent the last 7 years of his life trying to get back to you." Dean did not answer. He could not. Birch lifted his head off the floor and looked up at him, and Dean put a hand down on the dog's neck because he needed to hold on to something solid. And the something solid was warm and breathing and had found this for him. Fay told him the first piece of it there at the counter while the coffee went cold. Ray Marsh had come to Harmon Bay about 35 years ago, she said. A quiet man, hard worker, took a job on the fishing boats and then a job fixing the boats when his back gave out on the water. He never talked much about where he came from. There was one thing the whole town knew about Ray Marsh, though, because he said it the way other men talk about the weather. He had a son. Somewhere south, he had a boy named Dean, and he was going to bring that boy home as soon as he got himself right. He never got himself right, Fay said, not the way he wanted, but he never stopped saying it either. Dean asked the only thing he could think to ask. He asked how Ray had died. Fay's hands went still on the counter. She said it was not a thing to talk about over a counter, and that there was a woman in town who could tell him better than she could, and that he should not go anywhere until the rain let up and she had fed him, because he had the look of a man who forgot to eat when something hit him hard. She was right about that. She put a plate in front of him without asking and a bowl of water down for Birch, and Dean ate because she stood there until he did. The woman Fay sent him to lived 3 streets back from the water in a small white house with a porch that sagged on one side. Her name was Eleanor Pruitt. She was 73 years old, thin and straight-backed, with white hair pinned up off her neck and hands that shook slightly when they were not holding on to something. She had been a nurse for 40 years, retired now, and she had known Ray Marsh better than anyone left alive in Harmon Bay. When she opened the door and saw Dean standing on her porch with a German shepherd at his side, she put one hand flat against the door frame and stared at him for so long that Dean began to wonder if he had frightened her. "You have his shoulders," she finally said, "and his eyes. Lord, you have his eyes." She stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, out of the wet. Bring the dog." Ray always had a dog. Her front room was small and warm, full of framed photographs and the smell of wood smoke and old paper. Birch walked the perimeter once, slow and careful, then chose a spot near Eleanor's chair and lay down beside it with a sigh, his chin on his paws. Eleanor looked down at the dog, and something in her face came undone, just slightly, just at the corners. He lowered herself into the chair and reached down and rested her shaking hand on Birch's head, and the dog let her. And Dean understood that whatever else happened in this house, the dog had already decided this woman was good. Eleanor told him the rest of it slowly over the course of an afternoon that bled into evening. She did not rush, and Dean did not push her, because some stories can only be told at the speed grief allows. Ray Marsh had come to Harmon Bay, a broken man. She said he had married young. Down south, and the marriage had gone bad in the way that marriages do when a man drinks to outrun something he will not name. He had loved his wife and his boy, Eleanor said, but loving them had not been enough to make him stay sober. And one terrible night he had understood that the most loving thing he could do was to remove himself before he did the kind of damage that could not be undone. So he had gone, not because he did not want his son, because he believed in the broken arithmetic of a sick man, that his son was safer without him. He told himself he would come back when he was clean, Eleanor said. He told himself that for years, and he did get clean eventually. It took him a long time, longer than it should have, but he did it. By the time I knew him well, he had 8 years sober and a notebook full of letters he had written to you and never sent. Dean's throat closed. "Letters," he said. "Every birthday," Eleanor said. "Every Christmas." He wrote them all out, and he could never make himself mail them because he was ashamed, and because he was afraid your mother had told you he was dead, and he did not want to be a ghost that came back to haunt a boy who had made his peace. She looked at him steadily. He was wrong to wait. He knew he was wrong. By the end, he was getting ready to come find you. He had saved the money. He had the address. He was going to drive south in the spring. What happened in the spring, Dean said. It was not a question. He already knew the shape of it. Some things you can feel coming the way you feel weather change in an old wound, Eleanor told him. There had been a fire the previous winter in the old cannery building down by the south end of the harbor. It was a vacant building by then, condemned, but a family had been living in it anyway, a young mother and her 2 small children, because they had nowhere else to go, and the winter had been hard. Raymarsh had been walking home from the boat works when he saw the smoke. He was the first one there. He went in 3 times. He brought the mother out, and then he went back and brought out the older child. And then the building was fully involved, and everyone screaming at him not to go back in. And he went back in anyway because there was still a baby inside, and Raymarsh was not a man who could stand on the grass and listen to that. He found the baby, Eleanor said. Her voice did not break, but it went very quiet, the way a voice goes when it has told a story many times, and the telling has worn the edges smooth without wearing away the weight. He got that baby out a window to the men on the ground, and then the roof came down before he could follow. The room was silent. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and somewhere down toward the water, a gull was calling. Birch lifted his head and looked at Dean, and Dean realized his own hands were shaking now, the way Eleanor's did, and he did not try to stop them. That baby, Eleanor said, is named Tomas Reyes, and he is 35 years old, and he has 2 children of his own, and he lives 4 blocks from here. Your father gave his life so that boy could have one. The whole town knows it. That is why his name is on the wall, Dean. Not because he served, though he did. Because of what he did in that fire. We put him on the wall because he was ours, and because he died, the way the best of us hope we would have the courage to. Dean sat in the warm little room and tried to hold all of it at once, and could not. The father he had spent his life resenting, the man who had walked out and left a hole, had not been a man who ran from things. He had been a man who ran into a burning building 3 times for strangers. The story Dean had built his whole interior architecture around, the story of the father who did not care, collapsed in a single afternoon, and there was nothing to put in its place yet but a name on a wall and an old nurse's shaking hand. He stayed in Harmon Bay that night. He had meant to finish the hauling run and keep moving, but he could not make himself drive away from the unfinished thing, and Fay Wexler, when he came back to the diner near closing, simply told him there was a room above the hardware store that the owner rented cheap and that she would call ahead. People in Harmon Bay seemed to do that. He was learning. They arranged things for you before you knew to ask. The next morning was clear and cold, the sky scrubbed clean by the storm, and Dean walked back to the memorial with Birch in the early light. He stood in front of his father's name for a long time. Without the rain, he could see the wall properly. Now, see how well it was kept, see the small bronze vase set into the granite below Ray's name with a few sprigs of evergreen in it, fresh, recently placed. Somebody was tending his father's name. Somebody had been tending it for years. He learned who that afternoon, and the learning of it nearly broke him. He had gone to find Eleanor again with questions he had been too overwhelmed to ask the day before. She was not at her house. A neighbor told him she would be down at the community hall, that Wednesdays were the day the church group made meals for the homebound, and that Eleanor still went every week, even though her hands had gotten bad, because she said her hands could still stir a pot if somebody else did the chopping. Dean walked down to the hall, and that was where he met the rest of them. That was where the town stopped being a backdrop and became people. The community hall was an old building that had once been a grange, with a long kitchen and a longer table and a wood stove going in the corner against the morning chill. There were maybe a dozen people working when Dean came in, most of them gray-haired, all of them moving with the easy choreography of people who had done this together for years. Eleanor was at the far end with a wooden spoon. Beside her, a man about Dean's own age was chopping onions with the focused care of someone who took the job seriously. He was broad and dark-haired, with kind eyes and forearms marked by old scars that Dean recognized, because Dean had scars like them, the kind that come from heat. "That's Thomas," Eleanor said when she saw where Dean was looking. "Go on. He has wanted to meet you his whole life. He just didn't know your name." Dean did not know how to walk across a room toward a man his father had died to save. There is no training for that. He did it anyway, one boot in front of the other, with Birch close at his side, and when Tomas Reyes looked up and saw the dog and then the man and then understood, somehow, who the man must be, he set down the knife and wiped his hands on his apron, and his face did a complicated thing that Dean would not have words for until much later. "You're his boy," Tomas said. "You're Dean I am," Dean said. Thomas Reyes crossed the rest of the distance himself and put out his hand, and when Dean took it, the younger man held on with both of his, and the two of them stood there in the warm kitchen, with a dozen old people pretending very hard not to watch. "I owe him everything I have," Tomas said. His voice was steady, but only barely. "My wife, my kids. Every day of my life since I was a baby, I never got to thank him. So I thank you because you're the closest I will ever come." He paused and his jaw worked. "I've been putting the greens on his stone for 15 years. Since I was old enough to understand what he did, I figured somebody ought to, since his family didn't know to." That last part was not meant to wound. Dean understood. Thomas did not know the story, did not know about the mother who pressed her lips together, did not know that Dean had grown up believing his father simply did not love him enough to stay. It landed in Dean like a blade. All the same, because it was true, his father's family had not known to tend the grave. His father's family had spent 36 years getting the story exactly backward. Dean stayed a second day and then a third. He told himself each morning that he would leave, and each morning he found a reason not to. The reasons were small. Eleanor wanted to show him the notebook of letters, but it was at her sister's house 2 towns over, and the sister would bring it Friday. Tomas wanted him to come to dinner and meet the kids. Faye wanted to feed him. Birch had decided he liked the porch above the hardware store, where the morning sun came in warm, and a man does not lightly disrupt a dog who has found a patch of sun. But the real reason Dean stayed was the thing he could not say out loud yet, the thing that had been growing in him since Birch first refused to move from the wall. He had spent his whole life leaving places before they could become home, because the first home had taught him that homes were things that fell apart and left holes. And here was a town full of people who had loved his father, who were prepared, it seemed, to love him too, simply because he was Ray Marsh's boy. It frightened him more than any deployment ever had. Combat had a shape he understood. This did not. On the 4th day, the trouble started, and it came. The way trouble often does in towns, the world has half forgotten wearing a clean coat and carrying paperwork. Dean was at the diner when the man came in. He was perhaps 50, smooth-faced and out of place. in a charcoal overcoat that had never seen salt water, and he carried a leather folder under his arm the way some men carry authority. He ordered coffee he did not drink and made small talk. Fay did not return, and then he got to what he had come for, which was the cannery property at the south end of the harbor. The burned building had been cleared years ago. The land had sat empty. And now, the man explained with a smile that did not reach his eyes, his firm had acquired the rights to the whole south parcel, including the small triangle of harbor-front grass where the war memorial stood, and they would be needing to relocate the memorial to make way for the development. The diner went quiet. Fay set down the pot. "That memorial's been there 60 years, she said. "And it will have a lovely new home," the man said. "We're proposing a site up by the highway. Much more visibility, many more visitors." He slid a glossy rendering out of his folder and laid it on the counter, a drawing of a clean new plaza with the old granite wall sitting in the middle of it like a tooth pulled and set in a jar. "The town council votes on the easement Monday. I'm simply here to make sure everyone understands what a wonderful opportunity this is." Dean looked at the rendering for a long moment. Then he looked at the man, and the man, sensing something, looked back, and Birch, under the counter, rose to his feet without a sound and stood. He did not growl. He simply stood, ears forward, eyes fixed on the man in the charcoal coat, and the man's smile flickered for just a half-second before he put it back in place. Dean had learned to read that flicker in a dozen countries. It was the look of a man who is not used to being seen clearly. "Where would my father's name go?" Dean said quietly. The man blinked. "I'm sorry. My father's name is cut into that wall," Dean said. "Raymond Marsh. He died pulling 3 people out of the fire in the building your firm wants to put condos on top of. So I'm asking, when you move the wall up by the highway for the visibility, where does his name go?" The man recovered quickly. "They always did. He said the wall would be relocated intact, that every name would be preserved, that the firm had the deepest respect for the community's heritage. He said it smoothly and completely, and it meant nothing, and everyone in the diner knew it meant nothing." And the man gathered his rendering and his folder and left a business card on the counter that Fay did not touch. When the door closed behind him, the diner stayed quiet. Then Fay picked up the business card, looked at it, and dropped it in the trash. "His name," she said, "is Garrett Vance. He's been buying up the waterfront for 2 years. Boats, the old net house, the parcel where the Hendersons used to live before they couldn't make the taxes. He's good at it. He finds the towns that are tired, and he waits for them to be too tired to fight." She looked at Dean. "We've lost every parcel he's gone after so far. Nobody's had the wind to stop him." Dean did not say anything. That night, in the room above the hardware store, with Birch stretched across the foot of the narrow bed and the harbor lights coming through the window, he did not sleep. He lay awake and he thought about a man he had never known going back into a fire a 3rd time, and he thought about a wall up by a highway with his father's name on it like a tooth in a jar, and somewhere in the long dark hours, the thing he had been afraid to feel finally arrived. And it was not grief, or not only grief. It was the old protective anger he knew from the Corps, banked and disciplined, and pointed now at a man in a charcoal coat. For the first time in years, Dean wanted to stay somewhere long enough to fight for it. He started the next morning, and he started the way his father's town had taught him things were done here, by going to the people. Eleanor knew the history of every parcel on the waterfront. Fay knew everyone in town and who owed whom a favor. Thomas knew the building trades, had worked them his whole life, and more than that, Thomas had standing because Thomas was the baby from the fire, and there was not a soul in Harmon Bay. Dean sat at Eleanor's kitchen table that afternoon with the three of them and Birch under the table, and he laid it out the way he would have laid out a problem to a fire team, plainly, without heat. The development needed the easement across the Memorial Triangle to make the parcel work. Without that strip of grass, the access road did not connect, and the whole project lost its footing. So the fight was not about the whole waterfront. The fight was about one triangle of grass and one granite wall. If they could keep the council from granting the easement on Monday, Garrett Vance's project stalled, maybe for good. "He'll have something," Eleanor said. "He always has something, some paper that says the town agreed to it years ago. He found an old utility easement on the Henderson place that nobody remembered signing. That's how he took it." Dean thought about that. "Ras. Then we find the paper before he uses it," he said. "And we find out if it's real. The next days were not dramatic. That is not how these things are won." They were days of patient work, of Eleanor and two other women going through 40 years of town records in the basement of the library, of Tomas walking Dean over every inch of the south parcel and the Memorial Triangle with a tape measure and a level, of Fay making call after call from the phone behind the counter. Dean had expected somewhere in him that he would have to carry it. He had spent his life as the one who carried things. Instead, he found that the moment he set the problem down on the table, a dozen hands reached for it, and he had only to keep the work organized and keep the people fed and keep showing up. That was the part that undid him in the end. Not the grief and not the anger, the showing up. He had never in his life been part of something that simply assumed he would be there in the morning. They found it on the third day. Eleanor's hands were too shaky for the fine work, so she read the old ledgers aloud while a younger woman turned the pages, and on the third afternoon she went very still and said, "Here." The Memorial Triangle had not been an accident of grass. In the year the wall was built, the families of the men named on it had deeded that triangle to the town in trust, explicitly and in plain language, for the perpetual placement of the memorial and for no other purpose. It was not a park. It was not surplus town land that the council could trade away. It was held in trust, and the trust had teeth, and Garrett Vance's easement could not cross it without breaking a 60-year-old deed that named. Dean read the document himself. Twice, to be sure. Birch sat beside the table with his chin on Dean's knee, and Dean rested one hand on the dog's head the way he had learned to when something large was happening inside him. He had to have known, Dean said. "Vance, he does this for a living. He knew the trust was there." "Then why come in smiling?" Tomas said. "Because he was betting nobody here had the win left to find it," Dean said. And he remembered Fay's words from the diner, and he understood that the cruelty of a man like Garrett Vance was not in what he did, but in what he counted on. He counted on tired people staying tired. He counted on grief staying buried. He counted on the families of the dead not knowing to tend the grave. The council met Monday night in the community hall, the same room where Dean had met Thomas, over a cutting board full of onions. By the time the meeting started, the hall was full. What had gone around the way word goes around in a small town, by phone and by porch and by the front counter at Wexler's, and people who had not come to a council meeting in years came to this one. Garrett Vance was there in his charcoal coat with a lawyer beside him and his glossy rendering on an easel, and he was halfway through his smooth presentation about visibility and opportunity when the council chair, an old man who had once captained a fishing boat, asked if anyone from the public wished to speak. Dean stood up. He was not a man who spoke in rooms. He had spent his life making himself small in groups, sitting near the exits, saying what needed saying, and nothing more. Now he stood up in the crowded hall with Birch at his side, and he did not raise his voice, and the room got quiet to hear him, because quiet men are worth hearing when they finally choose to speak. He told them who he was. He told them about the name on the wall, and how he had found it by accident in the rain, because his dog would not walk past it. He told them the story Eleanor had told him, the story of a man who went into a fire 3 times, and he watched Tomas Reyes lower his head and his wife take his hand. And then he told them about the trust, and he laid the 60-year-old deed on the table in front of the council, and he said the only thing he had come to say. "My father deeded a piece of himself to this town before I was ever old enough to know him," Dean said. The men named on that wall asked one thing in return, that the ground stay theirs. I came here a stranger 4 days ago. I am asking you to keep a promise that was made to the dead, because the dead kept theirs. The room was silent. Garrett Vance's lawyer was already paging through the deed, and Dean could see in the man's face the exact moment he understood that the trust was real and the easement was dead. Vance himself sat very still, the smile gone now, just a man in a coat that had never seen salt water in a town that had finally found its wind. He did not argue. Men like him do not argue when the paper turns against them. He gathered his rendering off the easel, and he and his lawyer left before the vote. The door closed behind them, and somewhere in the back of the hall, someone began, quietly, to clap. And then the whole room was on its feet. The council voted to affirm the trust and deny the easement 7-0. Garrett Vance did not come back to Harmon Bay. Fay heard some weeks later that his firm had quietly let its options on the waterfront lapse and moved on to some other tired town up the coast. And Dean felt no triumph in it, only the plain satisfaction of a thing set right. The wall stayed where it had stood for 60 years, in the triangle of grass, where 3 roads met, looking out over the gray water his father had loved enough to die beside. Dean did not leave. He told himself the morning after the vote that he would finish the hauling run he had abandoned, and he did finish it, driving the restored equipment the last 40 miles up the coast and delivering it and collecting his pay. Then he drove back. He had nothing to drive back to anywhere else. He realized somewhere on that road, and for the first time, the nothing did not feel like freedom. It felt like a question that Harmon Bay had answered before he knew to ask it. Eleanor's sister brought the notebook on a Friday, as promised. Dean took it back to the room above the hardware store, and he sat by the window with Birch beside him, and he read his father's letters, every one, in order. From the first shaky entry, written when Dean was 5, to the last one, dated the winter of the fire, that began, "I am coming in the spring, son, and I am going to ask you for nothing but the chance to tell you I am sorry." He read them all. He did not cry until the last one, and then he cried for a long time, the way a man cries when a wound 36 years old finally closes, and Birch pressed against him through all of it, and did not move away. He moved into a small place near the water that spring. Tomas helped him fix the roof. Fay fed him most days and stopped charging him after a while, and when he protested, she told him to hush, that he was Ray's boy, and Ray's boy ate at Wexler's, and that was the end of it. Eleanor's hands kept getting worse, and Dean took over the chopping at the Wednesday meals, standing where Thomas had stood the day they met, and Birch lay by the wood stove and let the old people fuss over him, which they did, endlessly, because a town that has loved a man will love his son's dog without being asked. On a clear morning, early that summer, Dean walked down to the memorial with Birch and a small bronze vase of his own, and he set fresh evergreen below his father's name beside the sprigs Thomas still brought, and the two of them, the men whose lives had crossed in a fire neither of them could remember the same way, tended the stone together now. Dean stood there in the early light, with his hand flat against the granite, the same as the day he had found it, but everything underneath the hand was different. The name was no longer a wall he had never visited. It was his father, and it was his town, and it was his to keep. Birch sat beside him in the grass, ears forward, calm, the way he sat when there was nothing in the world that needed warning against. Dean looked down at the dog who had refused to walk past. The dog who had found his father for him when he did not know he was looking, and he understood that he had been brought here, that some things are too precise to be only chance, and that a man who spends his whole life leaving can still, if he is lucky, be stopped by a dog. In the rain, in front of the one wall he needed to read. He stayed. After a lifetime of leaving, Dean Marsh stayed, and the staying was the truest thing he had ever done. If you have ever carried a story about someone who left you, I want you to sit with this one tonight. Sometimes the people we believe abandoned us were fighting their whole lives to find a way back to us, and the world simply did not give them the time. Sometimes the truth is kinder than the story we were handed, and it waits for us patiently, cut in stone, in a town we never meant to stop in, until something faithful and good refuses to let us walk past. May you find your way to the truth that has been waiting for you. May you discover that you were loved more than you were ever told. And may God watch over you and your family and everyone you have ever grieved without knowing the whole of their story. Thank you for staying until the end.